Hi friends, welcome back to my channel. My name is Katie. This is Life Between Words. It's March, which means it's middle grade March, but that also means I need to talk about the books that I read in February, so let's get right into it. I read 4 books in February, which is not my biggest reading month, it's not my smallest reading month, but every book that I read left a big impression on me. I wouldn't say that any of the impressions that were made were negative necessarily. However, I do have a least favorite and a most favorite, and I actually might talk about those first because they overlap in some really interesting ways. So the first book that I'm going to talk about is my least favorite book of the month. But the reading experience was wonderful. This would make an excellent book club book, and I read it with some of my favorite bookish people who I talk about all the time. So anyway, we read White Oleander by Janet Fitch. This is kind of a classic from the 90s. It tells the story of this little girl, young woman named Astrid. She starts out the story maybe as a little girl. But she's not so much a little girl throughout, she grows up as the story goes along. At the beginning of the story, we get a very brief introduction to Astrid's very complicated, dysfunctional relationship with her mother. Her mother is sort of maybe an archetype for the manic pixie dream girl. She's sort of this ethereal, really, really beautiful, very manic woman. Anyway, she ends up going to prison for murdering her boyfriend. Her mother is not a good person and holds sway in really complicated ways over Astrid and Astrid's life. It's really uncomfortable to read about because it's very clear that Astrid's mother, while they never say that she is a sociopath, she has very little empathy and she's extremely selfish. Anyway, the book follows Astrid as she moves in and out of different foster care situations. All of her foster care homes are awful. I mean, the worst of the worst kinds of foster care situations that you could imagine. That is her life, and that is what this book is. It is dark, it is depressing, it is definitely thought-provoking. I never felt connected to the character of Astrid, which, as you know, if you've been around my channel long enough, you know that whether or not I like a character, I need to connect with them on some level. This book was written very detached. And one of the things I loved that came up in the conversation I had with these ladies that I read the book with is that we all think it was done very intentionally. I read another book last year called The Underground Railroad by Colson Whitehead. It got a lot of accolades, and I felt very similar reading that book. The main character in White Oleander and The Underground Railroad both went through an incredible amount of trauma. And as such, as anyone who's been through that kind of trauma, prolonged trauma, they would likely not want people to get close to them, and so they would keep people at a distance and remain very detached, and that is the voice that we got in White Oleander. And so even though I feel like that was very intentional, it was done purposefully, I don't like that kind of writing. I don't like feeling detached from the characters. I want to empathize with them, and I feel that it's really hard to do that when they're not written intimately. So while I got to know Astrid very well, and she lets you into her thoughts, she just doesn't let you into her feelings, and that is really difficult. So ultimately, I liked this book. I thought that it was worthwhile. I got a lot out of it, and it's a story that will remain with me for a very long time. However, it's just not a favorite, and I know that this is a favorite for so many people, and I get it, but I also feel like either you have to relate to Astrid because you have similar life circumstances or you relate to some aspect of her life, or you need to have been a teenager and you can relate to some of the angst that happens in it, which is an interesting dichotomy since I felt the book was really angsty, but I also felt really detached from it. The other thing about this book is that it has extremely flowery writing. It's very poetic, but it didn't always work for me. There were multiple times when I rolled my eyes because I thought that the writing was so stupid. And I'm sorry if you think that the writing in this is beautiful, because I do think that there were moments where the writing was absolutely stunning, but there were also times when I was like, this is completely overwrought. Metaphors and similes abound in this book. And it got to the point where I was like, okay, just stop with the metaphors and similes every sentence. It's too much. So anyway, I know that I'm being really critical of this, but I did really like it. I think I was so critical of it because so many people say that this is their favorite book. So I went into it with some heightened expectations. The next book I want to talk about was my favorite book from the month. I read White Oleander at the beginning of the month, and I read Eleanor Oliphant is Completely Fine at the end of the month. So I'm mixing up my wrap-up a little bit, but I wanted to mention this one next because this book had some overlap in theme with White Oleander. Eleanor, like Astrid, had a really traumatic childhood. Her mother had a really negative influence on her life. She was a terrible person. She was selfish, and she was quite possibly sociopathic. And in this book, Eleanor is working herself out from underneath her mother's influence. And like Astrid as well, she was in and out of foster care growing up because she was removed from her mother and that terrible toxic situation. You do learn more about that, but I don't want to say anything because that's part of the story. That's part of what's being revealed in this book. The story is beautiful. What stood out so much for me between White Oleander and Eleanor Oliphant is that while the tone in White Oleander is a little bit cold and detached, the tone in Eleanor Oliphant is warm and big-hearted and inviting. It just ultimately was much more my speed. So while the themes overlapped, these two women with really hard childhoods, really hard pasts, and really difficult mothers, the tone was so much more inviting in this book, and I got wrapped up in the story so much more. And I fell in love with Eleanor Oliphant in ways that I never was able to fall in love with Astrid. So I loved this book. It also had a lot more humor than White Oleander. While you learn things in this book that are very dark, you never feel weighed down by that. And to me, that is an expertly crafted book. I know that there are really terrible things in this world, and it's hard sometimes to create some levity in situations like that or in books like that that are dealing with really depressing things. But when an author is able to shine some light into that dark, that is the best. That to me is just more the kind of book that I like to read. I just thought that this book was excellent and brought everything to the table. I didn't mention what Eleanor Oliphant is about, so let me just tell you real quickly. Eleanor is a 29-year-old woman who is working a job. She has no friends. She has no life. Every weekend she goes home and she buys a bottle of vodka and she drinks the whole bottle of vodka throughout the weekend. And there are a lot of reasons that she does this that you come to understand throughout the book. She is really socially awkward, maybe even more than that, socially unaware, and this book is about finding herself, and it's beautiful, and I encourage you all to pick it up. I also read The Alienists this month. This is an historical fiction thriller written by Caleb Carr. It was also written in the 90s, like White Oleander, and it is probably the most disturbing book I have ever read in my life. Definitely thrilling, definitely fascinating. It follows a group of people, including an alienist named Laszlo Chrysler, who are commissioned, sort of, by the police commissioner, Teddy Roosevelt, in the late 19th century, late 1800s, to find a serial killer. This serial killer has been targeting sort of prepubescent, cross-dressing prostitutes, young boys, and it's horrific, horrific what this serial killer does to these boys. But what is so fascinating is that this was sort of on the cusp of our modern understanding of serial killers and what makes serial killers tick, and so it really gets in depth behind what makes a serial killer. So this is not a whodunit in that we are introduced to all these characters and then we have to figure out which one of these characters committed the murder. We don't know who committed the murder. The point of this novel is the investigators paint a portrait of who this serial killer might be, what his childhood looked like, what is driving him and leading him to commit these murders, and in that way they are able to zero in and figure out who it is. It's so fascinating, but like I said, it is incredibly disturbing. It is not for the faint of heart. I do think that if you're a fan of shows like Law and Order SVU, things along those lines that really get down into the dirt, into the seedy underbelly of the world, then you'll probably like this. I ended up really liking this book. The disturbing scenes were hard to swallow and hard for me to read about. But I do kind of have a morbid fascination with what makes serial killers tick, and the psychology of that, and learning about that from a historical perspective was incredibly absorbing. So that is what I have to say about this book. If that sounds good to you, I do highly recommend it. It is kind of considered a classic in this subgenre, but just know that it was gruesome and just absolutely horrific. So if that's not your cup of tea, steer clear. The last book I have to talk to you about is The Bear and the Nightingale by Katherine Arden. Now, I have heard mostly positive reviews of this book, but I have run across a few mediocre, middling reviews. I tend to fall in the former category. I loved this book. I thought it was so well done. It felt like a fairy tale. It was magical, and I found the story absorbing. I will say that it was slow to start, so it wasn't like a page turner right off the bat, but it turned into a page turner towards the end. I tend to prefer character-driven novels, and so I felt like the slow build in this book was appropriate and worthwhile, because we really get to know the characters, we really get to know the setting, we really get to know this folklore that's driving the story, and it really did feel like a magical fairy tale. I found this book at the right time. I was in the right mood for it, and it was just wonderful. The one thing that I want to make a comment about, now I want to preface this by saying this did not take away from my enjoyment of the story. It was just something that I thought about as I was reading the book. I am kind of sensitive to portrayals of Christianity in books, and a few of the villains in this book were religious. What I think is interesting is that there were all of these religious people in the book. While religion was present, God was not present. He wasn't a character, he had no power, and all of these folkloric elements, all these folklore creatures did have a lot of power. And I just think that's interesting. My thoughts are a little bit confused because it kind of had to be written that way. If God were who I believe God is, and he were in this story wouldn't be the same, because all of the creatures, all of the folklore creatures would be under his dominion. So I'm not trying to be preachy at all, it's just something that I was thinking about while I was reading the book. I really enjoyed this magical fairy tale, and I'm pretty sure that I ordered the second book already because I need to know what happens next. I just want to be back in this world. Those were the 4 books that I read in February. It was a great reading month because all of these books, I had a lot to think about, a lot to chew on, a lot to enjoy. Even White Oleander, that I didn't love, I still liked, and I really liked the reading experience because I was reading it with all these other wonderful women in my life that I met because of BookTube. So we are into March. I hope that you guys have thought about participating in middle grade March. If you see this giant mess back here, those are all my unread middle grade books, so that I just have no spot for right now because I'm keeping them out because it's middle grade March and I'm reading all of the middle grade plus some other books. I do have a few adult novels that I'm sticking in there as well. I hope you guys are all having a great beginning to March, and I will talk to you later. Bye!